Greetings, I'm Craig Smyser with 1835 Realty. We're at one of the most historic and iconic places in the great state of Texas. We're going to take a tour of the Alamo on this road trip episode of Discover Austin. So we're going to spend some time here at the Alamo. We really need someone who knows what they're talking about. So we've asked Sherry, who's the Director of Education here and also does some tours, to tell us a bit about the Alamo. So just, I guess briefly, for folks who might not be familiar, the main little history of the Alamo.
Sure, absolutely. So it starts a long time ago. About 300 years ago, Spanish Franciscans set up a mission here along this beautiful river that they named the San Antonio River. And their intent was to bring their faith and build converts and citizens for New Spain, and so that they could hold on to this territory. So we start here early 1700s, and by the time we get to the end of the 1700s, this is a flourishing mission with hundreds of converts and people living here. But Spain has sort of drawn their attention away from this site, and we closed the mission in 1791. We actually have about a few years, 10 to 12 years of not much activity on this site, and then Spain decides to move troops into these grounds. And so even some of the original buildings that are still here today was used to house those troops. By the time we get to the 1800s, Mexico is trying to gain their independence and be independent from Spain, and that finally happens in 1821. And with Mexican independence, this area becomes the Mexican state of Tejas. Now, it's a very wide open, kind of dangerous place to live. Comanches, Apaches are raiding on a daily basis, and Mexicans start attempting to get others to come here and live, and most of those people would come from the United States. And so with the colonization in the early 1820s, Texas definitely begins to change. And in the meantime, those same Spanish troops have now raised a new flag here at the Alamo. They bring the name to the place. They come from a little town down south called Alamo de Parras. And so the cross belts of their uniform actually at one time say Alamo. And so this place is known as the Alamo from the time that they move in. And they become Mexican troops, maintaining the safety for the citizens of this area. Now, we have to fast forward a little bit more into the 1830s, and the people that are living here as Mexican citizens are not necessarily happy with their government, and they eventually intend to rebel. And that's exactly what's happening in late 1835 and early 1836. It would start with the battle in Gonzales, about 75 miles from here, and then it would move to San Antonio. Here, the Mexican troops numbered somewhere in the area of 600. Those 600 men were basically sent out by the Texans. They were defeated, and the Texans are in charge of the Alamo. The Alamo is an important place, not only because it is a fortress, and there are a lot of cannons here, so it's very well protected. It's also in San Antonio, and quite frankly, San Antonio was the most important place in Texas in those years. It was the crossroads of Texas. So even if you're coming from the interior of Mexico or any direction, you're going to come through San Antonio first. So each side wants to control this city. And so the Texans, once they are able to grasp control of the area from the Mexicans, set up operations here inside the Alamo. And of course, General Santa Anna, the president of Mexico, decides he's going to have to put down this growing rebellion once and for all. And he brings about 1,500 men to fight these some 200 men inside this garrison. It begins on February 23rd, 1836, and it would end on March 6th, 1836. So 13 days. They would try to repel the Mexican assaults day by day. On the final evening of March the 5th, General Santa Anna, commander himself, orders a full-scale attack against these walls on the morning of March the 6th. That probably starts around between 4 and 5 a.m. that morning, and it takes them about an hour and a half to kill every single man inside this garrison and take control of the Alamo. So the legacy from all of that is that a very small group of men, determined men, made a stand against a much larger army, in some way knowing that they would not be successful. And so that story started to spread from that very day, March the 6th. The people of Texas started hearing about what these men did here. They knew that the General Santa Anna would be coming for them next. He would be making his way to the east, looking for the rest of the Texans that would stand up against him. And they heard these stories. And at the final battle of the Texas Revolution on April 21st, 1836, General Santa Anna met General Sam Houston and his Texans at the Battle of San Jacinto. On that day, the Texans were successful and defeated the Mexican army, captured Santa Anna himself, and that was the beginning of the Republic of Texas. They had declared their independence, and now they had won their independence. And on that very day, April 21st, 1836, those men on that battlefield remembered the men here in San Antonio with the cries, "Remember the Alamo." And that's what most people know us for today. That very moment in time when other men who are victorious against General Santa Anna and his troops remember the men who laid down their lives. And that's the story of the Alamo in a nutshell. So we start out here on Alamo Plaza because from this vantage point you can see where the battle took place. Unfortunately, it doesn't look much like it did in 1836, but if we look closely, we can still find the areas where the heat of the fighting, the worst fighting took place. For instance, if we look across the street, straight across here, these buildings stand on top of what was the western wall of the Alamo. And so those walls are gone today, but a lot of the last bits of the fighting before the Mexican troops made their way inside the fortress happened there. And especially right over here in this gap that you see between these two buildings, that's where the southwest corner was located at. It's important because that's the corner that overlooked San Antonio. And so even on the very first day when General Santa Anna and his army arrived here, the Texians and Tejanos that defended this fort could stand on that corner and see the Mexican army coming into town because we sit up on a hill from the main plaza of San Antonio. And so by all accounts, Colonel Travis and Colonel Bowie were there on February 23rd, 1836. And it was from that point that they made the decision to fire the 18-pound cannon across the river into that plaza in the general direction of General Santa Anna. So if we continue on down the street here, we'll see what is a large post office and courthouse building today. That building stands on top of what would have been the northern wall of the Alamo. And right down here at the northwestern corner, where a hotel stands today, is where Colonel Travis most likely died. We know this because he had a slave here. His name was Joe, and Joe survived. He was allowed to go after the battle. And Joe's account says that Colonel Travis rushed to that corner on the morning of March the 6th, calling out commands to the other men that were working the cannons down there, and then took a bullet to the center of the forehead. And so what do we have that's original? Closer to this side, we have the Long Barrack. This is in fact the first stone structure ever built here at this mission. 1724, it's being worked on. It would serve as the convento or the headquarters for the missionaries in the 1700s, and then became housing for soldiers thereafter. So both the Spanish and the Mexican army occupied these buildings at one time before the Texians came in and take control of this fort in 1836. We also have the famous Shrine of Texas Liberty, what was built to be a church of the mission in the 1700s. It was never completed during that time frame, unfortunately, and so it has a new roof over it. And the most famous part of the building is the hump shape on the top there. We call it the parapet, but it's put there by the United States Army. About 1850, they decide they need a quartermaster depot here in San Antonio, and they actually lease this building from the Archdiocese of San Antonio. It doesn't have any roof over it, so they put on a pitched wooden roof, and when this roof was completed, it stuck up above the facade. And so they had to add some feature to hide that roof line, and that's the purpose of the parapet. If we look here on our southern side, it's a little bit more difficult to draw out the features as they're all gone today. But there was a wall right down here, just past this grassy area. That would have been the southern wall. And in that southern wall was the main gates to the Alamo. So if you have horses or carts or anything like that, they would have entered from that gateway. There had been a gap between this southern wall and the corner of this church. So they built a wooden fence of sorts that they called the palisade. And it was basically sharpened timbers that were just stuck in the ground next to each other. They would dig a deep trench so that it may be more difficult to try to go across that wall. And from most accounts, we believe that probably David Crockett was defending that area at some point that morning. Well, here we are in the Cavalry Courtyard. It is so named because during the Battle of the Alamo, it was where the horses were kept. It is a space that was enclosed at that time, and the defenders would have been all the way around the walls here. Today, it is a place where we talk to our visitors about the history of the Alamo. We have regular history talks that happen. But we also have these beautiful bronze statues that are out here now, trying to kind of draw attention to some of the more personas that were part of this entire event. And of course, the most famous of those is our friend David Crockett. Now, most people recognize that famous coonskin cap that he's always depicted wearing. The fact is that Crockett only started wearing a coonskin cap after there was a play done about his life. While he was alive, while he was in Washington, D.C. serving as a congressman, there was a very popular play that was based loosely upon his life. And so people started identifying him with that story and that character and even that character's clothing. So he at times felt the need to sort of live up to that image, and thus the buckskins and the coonskin cap. He worked his entire life until he went to Congress. We might say that that's a break from that physical labor type of existence he was known for. But after serving as a justice of the peace in Tennessee and even the state legislature, they elected him to the United States Congress, and he served for many years there. Now, in the end, he ran up against one Andrew Jackson, and they were on opposite ends of the topic of Indian removal. Now, of course, Andrew Jackson wanted all of the Indians moved out of the eastern part into Oklahoma. And Davy Crockett stood up against that, believing that they had been there first and that they deserved to stay where they had lived their entire lives. And of course, that wasn't a popular view back then. So he lost his seat in Congress. And in fact, as he was leaving Tennessee, because he had made a promise, if they had chose to elect his opponent, that he was going to go to Texas. And he stops over in Memphis on his way to Texas, and he gets up on the stool and he tells the whole bunch, since y'all have seen proper to elect a timber toe is what he called him, because that man actually had a wooden leg. He said, y'all can go to hell because I'm going to Texas. He wrote only one letter back home on his journey out here, and that was to his daughter. And in that letter he says, please don't be worried about me. I'm amongst friends. Unfortunately, not too long after he gets here, he would be dead on March 6, 1836. So probably the most famous Alamo defender because of his life and times back in the United States before he comes here, but also because there's been so many movies and television programs and comic books and everything else done about this man. He's probably the most identifiable when people visit the Alamo. And now he stands here over Cavalry Courtyard watching over things. This little bridge here goes over the original acequia that came onto the grounds of the Alamo in the 1700s. Today we have koi fish. They're not original, of course, but in most accounts there are actual fish that they're fishing out of there throughout the 1700s and 1800s. This area would not have been within the original fortress. In fact, at the time of the Battle of the Alamo, Mexican troops on horseback, called lancers, rode back and forth on this eastern side to prevent them from escaping this direction. Okay. We also have our history camp, our living history camp, I should call it. We have a full team of individuals that depict life in the 1800s. weapons demonstrations, cannons. We even have a medical doctor here. Scott is showing simple procedures of medical doctors here at the Alamo. Our visitors really like this area.
Yeah.
You know, it's a really fabulous chance to sort of interact with the living historians and learn more about the men who fought the battle and just the life of those people that lived in Texas and in the 1830s.
Yeah.
It's hard to sort of relate to sometimes, you know, the tools and things that they had that and did quite well for themselves, you know, out here on this frontier. And so that's what this space is used for. We do demonstrations. It looks like the military is getting ready to have a ceremony over here on this side, and that happens quite often here. We have, of course, Air Force, Marines, and Army here in town, and they feel a tie to this site, you know, rightfully so. So they have a lot of their promotion ceremonies, retirement ceremonies, things like that here on the grounds as well.
The Alamo is quintessential Texas history, and every Texan should visit. I'm Craig Smyser with 1835 Realty.
And I'm Sherry Driscoll with the Alamo.
Thanks for joining us for this road trip episode of Discover Austin.